Good morning and welcome. Today we have Charles Bedford, the Chief Impact Officer for Carbon Growth Partners. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks, Kevin.
So look, you've been in this industry for decades. Why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about your background? I think we're very interested in who you are, and then we can dive into more into about Carbon Growth Partners.
Yeah, well, look, I'm an economist and a lawyer by training and haven't been doing any of that since getting those trainings. I've been mostly in politics and government in the early part of my career, and then in the NGO space with the Nature Conservancy, where I worked for 2 decades in chunks of the world, Colorado first, and then North Asia, and then all of Asia Pacific to do conservation. And the Nature Conservancy is great because it really does hands-on, tangible projects. It's very much, nature's banker, nature's, project manager. And so that was a terrific spot to get a lot of experience on that front. And we did a lot of work on carbon sequestration, carbon projects around the world as well, and including quite a bit in China while I was there. About 4 or 5 years ago, my partners and I, Rich Gilmore and a couple of others, left the Nature Conservancy to form Carbon Growth Partners because we knew that philanthropy, charitable money, was not going to solve the big problems of biodiversity loss and climate change. We wanted to step into the big rivers of global capital and figure out how to divert and channel some of those rivers of capital towards dealing with the big problems of climate change and biodiversity loss, because we knew that the tiny fraction of money that comes into those spaces from philanthropy just wasn't going to get the job done. And the carbon markets and climate change, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, have really offered an option for that. Fits and starts with some terrific examples like in Europe or in California, where you have regulated markets that have taken off and started to bend the curve down in terms of emissions. And then in the voluntary market, where companies have basically stepped into the vacuum of regulation and said, hey, we're going to do our part. We're going to get to net zero by a certain date and make a set of commitments. And the carbon market, essentially provides the space and tool to drive the lowest cost of carbon abatement across the world. So that's how I got where I am. I've been in Hong Kong for 14 years and Asia for 16. So that's my home. Although, as you can tell by my accent, I'm an American.
Fantastic. And how did your background in conservation really help you do what you're doing now with Carbon Growth Partners?
Yeah, it's a great question. Conservationists, moving into the finance world, or finance people moving into the conservation world, you don't see that a lot.
Yeah.
But as a lawyer, you kind of look at the world with a bit of a different angle. And through my work with the Nature Conservancy, doing projects in super complicated political and legal and cultural and social environments in the developing world is basically a cut and paste into the carbon markets, because most carbon projects happen in places like Papua New Guinea or Laos or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they need to address the drivers of deforestation. They need to reforest and restore. They need to have transition to clean energy instead of building coal-fired power plants. They need respite from the terrible Three Stone fires that cause so much respiratory illness. So those are the real drivers, and those are the sorts of things that working in the NGO sector, patiently focused on building the kind of projects in those difficult to work places, is what made that transition work.
Amazing. And would you encourage more people from the conservation space to look into the capital markets the way you have?
Well, yeah, I think you're seeing that more and more. Great groups like TNC, Conservation International, WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, has been a great player in the carbon markets forever, working on avoided deforestation projects. They do a super good job, high quality. But NGOs aren't really structured to scale, right? They're structured to experiment and test. And so what needs to happen is we need to actually move those great examples of perfect, really good projects that the NGOs have pioneered into a more cost-effective and scalable model. And I think that's where
Yeah,
capital markets can do.
that's a perfect segue into just telling us about Carbon Growth Partners. Look, I've heard a lot of great things about them. I've met you and your co-founders. Um, but yeah, how are you catalyzing and how are you catalyzing these markets? And what does Carbon Growth Partners do?
So it's I mean, I'm not one of the guys who's super savvy on the investment lexicon, but I'd kind of put this in a similar space of getting very upstream, right? As far upstream as you can, to help and the investment process to help projects do the right thing, do it well, so that as they move downstream and as they create these projects and as they create a set of stream of credits that come off of the projects, that they're generating high quality credits. So we try to get as far upstream, help on the project design, help on the marketing materials, help on the community consultation, and then work with the teams as they're making things happen in places like Guatemala and Colombia and Indonesia, work with them to make sure that the message of the power of what they're doing gets out as well. So
Yeah,
it's a combination of problem solving and communications and then bringing capital, of course, bringing capital to a project that has a high risk profile. Right? These are not easy places to work.
yeah, absolutely. And what is Carbon Growth Partners' overarching investment thesis, and how do you ground it in the work that in the conservation work of your background?
Well, look, we fundamentally believe that price drives basically everything. As a
Yeah,
general, we believe in the notion that markets are critical drivers for um, basically all of human behavior, right? So
yeah,
putting a price on carbon is the thing that's going to make the biggest difference in bending our emissions curve from now to 2050, where we have to get down to net zero, or else we are dealing with a almost inhospitable world and a difficult, very difficult transition for humans.
absolutely.
So pricing is really the basis of our thesis. The real cost of carbon, emissions essentially are an externality of other economic activity that's not captured by it. It needs to be captured by those activities and costed to them. And so the real cost of emissions is really something in between $100 and $300 a ton. The cost of actually capturing carbon in a forest or reforestation or avoiding emissions through cook stove distribution, or renewable energy construction in developing countries, that runs from between $7 to $10 and $20 or $30 a ton. So
Yeah,
that's a great bargain, right? If it costs you $7 to $30 a ton to grab carbon out of the air or not emit it in
great
most of the
market.
developing world, it's a great bargain, right?
Yeah,
Just the market hasn't priced it yet. And you get a few places like California and like Europe where the market has priced it in, and a lot of others that are starting to do that from a regulatory perspective,
yeah,
but we're not there yet. And once the world catches on that there are these opportunities for they're fairly low hanging fruit to capture carbon, to avoid emissions for relatively good price using market mechanisms, that's the notion.
yeah.
As regulation comes on board, as pricing happens in most of the developed world, we'll see that desire to drive the cost of the abatement down.
Let's unpack the. I mean, I love the fact that you talked about what actually goes into a project, whether it's in Papua New Guinea or Guatemala. Let's unpack what a carbon credit actually is, because I do think there's
Mm.
some confusion out there in the public or in mass media that carbon credits are some really, obscure thing up in the cloud. What actually is a carbon credit, and what goes into the projects that drive these credits?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and you can unpack that bag for all day long. But let's assume that we've got as we talked about earlier, limited attention spans. So carbon credits aren't really commodities. They're not really equities. They're something else entirely. Regulators trying to have get their heads around what to do with them. Essentially, a carbon credit is a certificate for something that has been done in the past and has been done on behalf of the environment. In the case of a carbon credit, it's a certificate that 1 ton of carbon has been avoided, emitted, or captured out of the atmosphere, and it goes through an elaborate certification process, and then a double audit process, and then a periodic audit. Credits are only awarded for work that's already been done, so you can't get it until you've done the work itself. So that requires, that requires financing, right? If you can't get rewarded until year 5 of a project with your product, you need financing for years 1 through 5, and so that's where we come in.
And those projects, what goes into them? What's the length of them? What it's required to work? I think
Yeah,
people hear about cook stoves to energy to all the way to reforestation. And what in your mind and what in your experience works best too in terms of best practices?
Well, the cool thing about the market is it's very innovative, right? There's 200 different ways of making a carbon credit, and more coming quickly. So that's great, right? And they're all science based, right? Each of these, let's call it a recipe for a carbon credit, or a methodology is what is used, the term used in the industry, is an elaborate recipe for doing something. So in the case of, let's say, distribution of cook stoves in places that are still using the 3 stone fires, essentially you have to understand what the non-renewable biomass that's being used by the inefficient stoves, and then how much less of that's being used when you bring the efficient stoves to bear. And that's a complex scientific calculation that involves field testing and remote sensing. So those are the sorts of calculus that has to go into each of these 200 different methodologies. There's a few common ones though, right? Replacing coal-fired power with renewables in least developed countries. Pretty easy calculus there, right? You put a solar field panel in, and you basically prevent or you don't need as much coal-fired power. Uganda is a place where we've invested in hydropower. Takes a little bit of water off the river, runs it through turbines, puts the water back in the river shortly downstream. Minimally disruptive to the hydrology and the fisheries, but generates 6 or 7% of Uganda's total national electricity needs. Pretty big bang for the buck. That creates a carbon credit. So those are the sorts of things that you see. So renewable energy, bringing renewable energy to least developed countries, preventing deforestation, doing reforestation, so reforesting places that have been cut down. Those are sort of 3 big different project types. And then cook stoves, probably another one that's really important. In addition to that, the distribution of those cook stoves is complex. For example, one of them we have invested in relies on manufacturers in Burundi shipping down the East African Lake system to the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then distributing those cook stoves through the Catholic Church, which is basically the main civil society organization in the Eastern DRC.
Wow. That's amazing. Let's unpack a little bit also about the criticism that carbon credits have received in the mainstream media lately. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe you can walk me through what's the nexus of the criticism and how you as a fund are dealing with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the carbon markets have essentially been a science experiment for the last 20 years. As what we've had and we talked about this a little bit earlier, you have a regulated market, which is essentially polluters paying other polluters to be more efficient, right? That's California, that's Europe. And then you have this unregulated market, this quote unquote voluntary market, which is essentially a couple of hundred projects out there that are different types of projects, methodologies. And they're all essentially, ongoing scientific hypotheses about, okay, if we do X, then we can get Y carbon out of the atmosphere. They're audited, they're updated. These methodologies go through iterations, but they're never perfect, right? Methodologies for removing carbon, just like methodologies for measuring carbon emissions, you're never going to get the exact perfect number, right? A ton is never going to be a ton in the carbon markets, whether they're the regulated markets or the voluntary markets. So we just have to get comfortable with that lack of perfect tonnage. What's happened is that the media has latched on, or I think for a couple of reasons, to projects that are, that have essentially said that they're doing a ton of carbon in terms of carbon sequestration, and they've pretty much been shown not to. So out of the 10,000 projects out there, there's definitely some stinkers, and they have been a real target for the media to say, look, these things are not doing what they say they're doing. They are exaggerating how much carbon they're sequestering or taking out of the atmosphere. And as a result, companies are buying these credits and then using them as an excuse to keep continuing to pollute.
Right.
Now, so that's the basics of the critique. Now, the companies themselves they're not actually required to do this, right? I mean, most companies are not inside a regulated market, and so the theory that the media is basically using, and some folks in the environmental space, are that, well, if these guys buy and retire carbon credits, then that gives them an excuse to keep doing business as usual. And so those are the two kind of critiques that we see in the carbon market.
Yeah. And where do you think this is going?
Well, I mean, I think there's an ideological divide, right? Do you believe that markets, which we all can agree, unfettered markets, have definitely caused some of the carbon, if not all the carbon emissions problem?
Yeah.
If you believe that that markets can't help fix that problem, and that you believe that only strict government regulation can fix it, well, you're going to throw rocks at the carbon market all day long. And I think that's where we are right now, right? Is basically, there's a lot of people out there who want to make the markets great and accurate, and they're working hard at it. Places, like Silvera, BZero, and Calix, the rating agencies, the ICVCM, these overarching bodies that are putting quality standards in places, the standards themselves. So everybody's very focused on making these things as accurate and clear and transparent as they can. But that's not going to convince people who don't believe markets should be involved in solving this problem.
Yeah.
That's a fundamentally philosophical question. So I think the question will be is, a few environmental NGOs will continue to throw rocks at this because they don't believe in the market solution, and they believe in a strict regulatory solution. Well, good on them. I hope they get that strict regulation system, in place. But in the meantime, and I think for those of us who are more pragmatic, we want to get going on these market solutions. And so I think and you see that already. I mean, companies are committed to this. Just yesterday, I think it was, a group of companies committed to, as part of a buyers coalition, to commit to buying 20 million tons of carbon dioxide removal every single year. This is Meta, Salesforce, and a couple of others. They're saying basically, look, here's our standards. We want to see good quality stuff, and we're committing to buying 20 million tons of that a year. That's a lot. That's a pretty big commitment, because removal credits can run from anywhere from $30 a ton to $700 a ton. So if you do, even at the lower end, that's $500 million a year, or $600 million a year that they're committing. So yeah. I think the companies are coming around to this notion that we're not going to get perfect, but we're going to get good, and we're going to get very good. when we're investing. We just have to be thoughtful about it.
Yeah, yeah. And what do you tell naysayers, whether it's media or potential investors, even when when they talk about the narrative that companies are just doing this to pay for their sins and it shouldn't be done?
Well, I'd rather have them pay for their sins than get off for free like they are now. So, so yeah, look, I'd love to see a perfect regulatory system at the global level. 197 countries all putting a price on carbon, regulating and putting in place, pollution control. But that's just not happening. And I think what we have is this period between now and perfect policy nirvana, which is probably a long time off in the future, where markets are going to have to step in and place a price on carbon.
Yeah.
And I think consumers and regulators and civil society are going to have to say, it's time. You not just that you should, not that just that it's a nice to do thing or that it belongs in your in-flight air magazine. There is a time when people, and I think we're very close to that, where people say you must offset and pay for all of your emissions,
Yeah.
even as you're declining and even as you're abating your emissions through your own supply chain. It's imperative that you offset every piece of carbon that you put into the atmosphere that you can't abate yourself, and that it just seems like common sense, right? Pay for every ton.
It's an amazing vision that there's a market that you pay for it and there's a market for externalities, which has always been the
Yeah.
biggest challenge in markets, actually. Given your background, you've seen this market development for decades now, actually, back from your time with the Nature Conservancy, all through doing this, and walk us through kind of the evolution of this market and the high points, the low points, and what we're going through now than where you see us going in the next 10 years. That's a
Well, I
big
think you see
question, bro.
some.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things. I'd start at the very top. The UN, I think, has done a great job in terms of thematic leadership. But in terms of pragmatic and practical tools, it's failed. And I don't think we should feel like that's a failure itself. I mean, that's not what the UN was designed for. You
Right.
don't get, you don't get to set market rules for a farmer's market with 197 people with a veto, right? So the 197 countries never going to come to agreement on market rules. That's okay because we have country by country countries making rules around emissions and around what you can do in the voluntary markets and the quasi-voluntary markets and the compliance markets, which are all essentially merging together as we speak. So that I think is an exciting, development. Is essentially that the markets stepping in where politics and the UN just essentially cannot provide the solution and will not. And we shouldn't expect them to, and we shouldn't be upset about it because we don't have world government, right?
Yeah.
So that's it's a high that they were able to set that leadership, and they do so. They bang the drum every single year at the COPs, hold each other kind of publicly accountable for their actions. I think that's terrific. I'm super excited about some of the corporate leadership. You see groups like Microsoft and Salesforce. You see Chinese companies like Tencent and Alibaba. Australia is a remarkable corporate environment, which is super focused on carbon neutrality, carbon emissions reduction, and then offsetting. So there's a whole host of leadership where you just won't expect it, as you wouldn't expect to see it coming from, because I think a lot of these corporates realize the long term, corporate benefit of a healthy planet, right, where we're not responding to emergencies all the time, or floods, or typhoons, hurricanes that are out of whack with what we would have expected normally. There's a business case for this for climate, a stable climate.
Right.
Just like there's a business case for a stable tax regime. We want a stable climate regime. So they see this and they go at it with a vengeance.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the difference between voluntary and compliance markets, and what's the relative size of each one?
Well, if my first answer to that question is not a thing. There's no difference between the voluntary and the compliance markets. Facetiously, not really facetiously. So here's what I mean by that. So compliance markets are essentially places where government said, all right, for a certain set of industries, heavy industries, the power sector, you basically got to reduce your carbon emissions over the next 20 years like this, down gradually. And then they say, if you can't do that, then we're going to permit you up to that level each year, and then you'll have to change,
Sure.
buy
Government
allowances from
sets the
people who
rule.
are more efficient. Yeah, yeah. You emit less, you can sell your permit to the other guys who have to emit more. That's a great market. And then the great thing about most of the markets is they also allow for carbon projects to be used in that regulatory system.
Right.
And what that's done there is essentially given the entire world this notion that you can go out and do projects that grab carbon out of the air or prevent emissions. And so those projects can be used in many cases in the compliance market. So they can be used in the California market, and they are extensively. Washington, Oregon, the Quebec markets. They're used extensively in the Mexican markets, state by state. They have the use of carbon projects, so planting trees, doing cook stove projects, can be used in place of the carbon permits that are being issued by state governments. Colombia is the same. South Africa, Korea, and Japan are super interesting and Singapore, because they have essentially said, look, we're going to have a compliance market, and we're going to have international compliance credits or voluntary credits being able to be used to pay your carbon tax or your carbon obligations in these places. So there you have, let's say a reforestation project in the Solomon Islands being able to be used to pay a Singapore carbon tax bill, which is terrific. It drives development and tech transfer to the Solomon Islands. It makes the cost of compliance in Singapore lower. It's a win-win for everybody. It's essentially becomes this fungible, interoperable carbon market. So first answer was no difference between the carbon for the voluntary and the compliance markets. Yeah, there's a difference. It's country by country. It's
Sure.
regulation by regulation, but increasingly you see almost this interoperability. The other thing that's really, I think, underestimated in terms of power is the Europeans' use of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I
Uh,
would say that has driven enormous innovation across the world in carbon markets, right? Because China, India, Korea, Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Vietnam, which are exporters into Europe, have to now account for the embedded carbon in their export products, because they get taxed on that embedded carbon at the border,
yeah.
right? And so minus whatever they're paying in their home market. And so the home markets are all now rushing to put in place coherent and thoughtful and transparent carbon tax and cap and trade systems that will allow for that tax burden to be lessened and to be captured at home, which I think is terrific. I mean, it's exactly what the Europeans intended, and so you'll see again essentially an evolution towards a completely interoperable carbon market globally, and towards a single carbon price, which I would suspect starts to congeal, kind of cohere towards the end of this decade.
I mean, that's the dream, right? I feel that these started off as completely separate things 10, 20 years ago, different people doing different things. And now the interoperability is really important in driving opportunities for investors like you and me. What I think
Yeah.
it's a great segue to go into talking little bit about Carbon Growth Partners, and how do you identify the great projects that you want to invest in, given that there's
Mm.
hundreds, thousands of opportunities out there.
Well, we in the Nature Conservancy we had a saying that conservation is always about people, not really about nature. Right? It's
Absolutely.
how do you, it's conservation is really the thing we do to make sure we're going to have a world that we want to live in and give to our kids. And I think the same is true of carbon projects. Carbon projects are really about the people, and I mean that from very much the base level. It's about working closely and sensitively with the owners. Really, the true owners of the carbon projects in many cases are indigenous people and local communities who some have land tenure, formal land tenure, others have informal land tenure or other sorts of rights. Some don't have much evidence of ownership at all, but they're still there, and they can. One, they deserve to be the participants and owners in these projects,
Yeah.
just from the equity perspective. But two, the projects can really bring huge benefits to them, including things like titling of land and schools and hospitals and healthcare, and employment. So all of those things really rest upon, like, what's the neighborhood you're working in? Who are you working with? Are they really excited, invested, and do they own, both in the literal, legal sense, as well as in the figurative sense, this project? So starting at the base level, who's there? What
Right.
are they up to? What do they want? What is their vision? And how can you help make that happen? I think that's one of the big kind of ingredients to the first ingredient to success, people. Second is probably the technical know-how, the project developer, their ethics, their values, their alignment with our values, and that's what we look for. Secondly,
Yeah. Yeah. And in your portfolio now, what's give us a sense of what the geographic distribution is.
we are a all continents, all types portfolio.
Wow.
So, um, we probably have we're over allocated carbon removals in the sense of reforestation and afforestation projects. We like the nature-based solutions. There's good bang for the buck on that, in terms of both the cost of doing it versus, engineered carbon removal solutions, and in terms of the benefits for local people. So we like that project type, afforestation and reforestation. Cook stoves, similarly, bringing huge benefits to people, reducing emissions, and also really, reducing the drudgery that women predominantly are faced with when they are having to do the cooking and boiling water every day, reducing the illness of women and especially children through so much smoke captured in enclosed cooking spaces. So those two project types, ARR project types, cook stoves, are really attractive to us. I would say methane capture. So either through smallholder agriculture, or even sort of community agriculture. So capturing manure before it goes into rivers, turning
Yeah.
it into methane, doing compost, getting that organic material back out onto the fields, and capturing the methane and creating clean energy, or putting it into the grid. Those are, I think, some
Yeah.
of the most attractive projects to us. The methane has got 25 to 30 times more potency in terms of its warming potential that carbon dioxide has, and so that's an easy win to focus on those sorts of projects.
Right. Right. And are there any red flags or specific deals or specific types of projects or geographies that you've just said no thank you to?
Yeah, we definitely have and it's an evolving list of geographies which are hard places to do work in, where the regulatory systems are not, mature yet, where the governments haven't really kind of got their act together and figured out how to facilitate and approve conservation, or carbon projects. That's certainly, it's a constantly shifting list. Fortunately, we see, I think, the globe, there's a lot of good examples out there in places like Ghana, in places like Colombia and Mexico, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, all these countries, South Africa, all these countries have started to put in place really smart kind of mechanisms to enable markets to really bring finance to those places to solve some of the social problems, but also use that carbon finance to do so. So that geography kind of constraints are shifting all the time, but when depends upon the month, someone's coming up that curve. Most of that is direction is positive. And then on the project types, we are, project type agnostic. We like nature-based solutions, and we're really intrigued by some other ones that are
Yeah.
sort of quasi-nature based, like cook stoves, which are essentially preventing deforestation.
Yeah.
Enhanced rock weathering, super interesting, pretty pricey still, and technology, but it's got some great benefits for small scale smallholder farmers, or even middle-sized agriculture, in terms of soil health. Biochar similarly can be done at small scales and scaled. You can have small scale, but very large numbers of biochar facilities that really benefit local people, and so that's exciting. And then, avoided deforestation projects. These are the ones where you're basically paying people to protect the forest from, illegal deforestation. We think that has a big place in the market. It's struggled because of a few bad projects in the last couple of years, but the new methodologies coming online, I think, are solved. They basically solve for the problems that were raised.
Yeah, yeah, those are great, and I love the fact that technology is developed to the point where it's now getting distributed across, developing countries and really making an impact. I did want to wrap up with a really important question, and I wanted to. I have a couple more around this, but I think one of the important things that investors are looking for um, are trying to understand the types of returns they can get from carbon markets. Can you just talk a little bit about what your target returns are? And I know you've got, and how much money you've raised to date with Carbon Growth Partners.
Yeah, yeah. So we have we were, I think, great in terms of timing, in terms of our talent set, and connections that we were able to connect to early in our company history. We were able to raise $100 million right off the bat in 2021, and place it in high quality projects. We raised another $50 million subsequent to that in 2022, and have placed that as well. It's been a terrific ride for us. We had no notion that we'd be able to get to that scale and run this hard, but we're very encouraged by it.
Yep.
It's been super fun to engage in this market.
Yeah, yeah. Congratulations on that. So, last question for potential investors that are not sure about investing in carbon or carbon markets, or funds that related to that. What would you tell them?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I mean, um, carbon markets are definitely complicated, and in their relative infancy. They've been around for 20 years, so not terribly young. But for investors and buyers in the carbon market, I think you need to have some seasoned guides with you to engage in a way that both learns from past lessons and anticipates the future. I think what we know is that the price of carbon has to rise in order to drive the sort of decarbonization that we need to have, right? And so, in some respects, this is a bit of a self-governing. The atmospheric chemistry is a bit of a self-governing system, brutally, in the long run, unless we can manage to voluntarily and through regulatory means tackle it in the meantime. And I think so that's why I think the price of carbon essentially has to rise in order to drop that concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's a direct relationship, right? The higher the price of carbon, the more expensive it is to emit, the less emissions you're going to have, and we start moving, instead of from where we are now at 425 parts per million, we need to get back to 250 parts per million. So that's the calculus. That kind of economic activity is in the trillions of dollars, not the billions, and it's a multi-decadal project. And so, if you want to get long the biggest project in human history, get involved in the carbon markets.
I love it. Look, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I think you shed some really interesting insights on how carbon markets work, both in the past and the future. We talked about the interoperability and the promise of that moving forward. Any last words, Charles, before we sign off here?
I'm not a practicing economist, but I would say that the price of carbon has to hit at a global average, at least $100 by 2030 for us to be successful. And I'm betting that that's going to be the case.
Where is it now?
Oh, it depends on where you are. Europe's about $60 or $70. California's and Australia are in the 30s. New Zealand's around 30. China, interestingly, has moved up from about $10 a ton a year ago to almost double that now. So I think we're seeing, the big economies starting to really put that price on and start to ratchet it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that all these other factors going on in the world uh, only heightened the climate crisis, and so
Absolutely.
Corporates and governments and the interoperability of markets right now, we're it's a good time to get in. Look,
Absolutely.
yeah, look, I appreciate your time, Charles, and yeah, thank you very much. You did great despite a little bit of jet lag.
Yeah, I did have the cup of coffee right at the beginning, so maybe I peaked about midways.
All right, thank you, Charles. See you.
Yeah, you bet, Kevin.